Okay, uh, a very warm welcome, literally warm, all pun intended, because hey, climate change. A very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today for the inaugural session of the Aclisa Speaker Series. This particular category of the speaker series, KidLit Beyond KidLit, was conceptualized with the idea of offering an intervention to the subconscious divide that continues to exist within academia, wherein children's and young adult literature studies is seen as a separate field of inquiry outside the known accepted canon. Moreover, as it is targeted at a group of readers in an entirely different stage of maturity and identity than adults, CYA literature bears significant potential, not just in literature departments, but also in other disciplines like history, education, anthropology, excuse me, among others. It is with this in mind that we invite speakers to speak on their research in this segment. The entire concept note can be found on our website, and we hope that you will join us for future sessions as well. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I will quickly go through the housekeeping for this meet. The talk will be 40 minutes long with Q&A for 20 minutes at the end. Please keep your audio and video muted for the duration of the talk. You may type in any questions and comments in the chat in the meantime, and we will address them at the end of the talk. Please be respectful and polite in your chat. The live caption has been enabled. If anyone wishes to disable or enable it personally, can do so, but on our end, we will enable it. The talk and the Q&A will be recorded. So please keep your video off. If you do not wish to be recorded, the video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and the link will be sent to those who registered. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Siddharth Pandey. Dr. Pandey is an interdisciplinary academic and creative practitioner from Shimla, currently based in Delhi. He has an MPhil and PhD from the Center for Research in Children's Literature, University of Cambridge, where he was based as a Cambridge Commonwealth and Cambridge International Scholar from 2012 to 2019. His doctoral thesis looked at the multifaceted ways in which ideas of making, craftsmanship, embodiment, and non-human materiality generate the sense of enchantment in fantasy narratives. Post-PhD, he received numerous research fellowships in art history, global history, travel cultures, and globalization studies from the Yale Center for British Art, the Center for Global History at Ludwig Maximilians University, Germany, the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, and the Kate Hamburger Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities Global Disconnect. His first book, Fossil, was published as part of the global arts endeavor running from Tasmania called Lost Rocks and was shortlisted for the 2022 Banff Mountain Literature Awards, widely considered the most prestigious global recognition for highland writing. He is also known as a landscape photographer with numerous commissions and displays in India and abroad, including the Oriental Museum, Durham, and at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. He continues to write for a variety of media and academic platforms and is currently working on diverse book projects related to Enchanted Landscapes. He can be found on Instagram as Siddharth Pandey. Dr. Pandey, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ritvika. Thank you, Titash, and thank you, Arpita, who is not here, unfortunately, for having me here. And thank you all of you for your very kind, benevolent presence. I am really delighted, privileged, honored to be having, this opportunity to speak the inaugural, to make the inaugural lecture for the Association for Children's Literature in South Asia. And I must say that I love the ring of the word ACLISA, the acronym. I'm sure that I do not know who devised it, but I'm pretty sure that whosoever did would have been quite happy at the ring of it. It has a very magical and fantastical ring, quite appropriate to the ethos of children's literature, about which this talk actually is. Ritvika, thank you so much for that lovely, generous introduction. I don't want to embarrass you, but I think Arpita said that I could take between, and she insisted that it should be between 45 minutes and 1 hour. So I think it will be a little long, the talk. And I do apologize for the length of it. And there'll be around 26 slides, but I really hope not to take more time than that. And I'm absolutely fine with having a discussion that runs way above 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, whatever it is. I'm totally fine with that. So thank you for this. It's I am speaking from Delhi NCR at the moment. But I am from Himachal, the state of Himachal Pradesh. And the topic, as you see, and the abstract that you must have read, refers to these enchanted landscapes. Um, the title is Magical Materialities, a personal journey through enchanted landscapes. And when Arpita had first approached me regarding what I should be talking about, um, we had a million ideas to discuss, and we basically ended up discussing everything under the sun. But I then thought that it might be good to make a presentation that was not entirely academic, even though I'm assuming that most of the people here are academics, simply because A, it is an inaugural talk. B, that most of you must have had the experience of sitting in academic talks for a long time. And I have nothing against academic talks. I'm myself an academic, so I completely understand the relevance of them. But given the topic and given that this is an inaugural thing, I felt that it might be interesting to talk about my personal journey and keep it a kind of a semi-academic presentation. And it's the reason is very simple, because at least in the remit, I mean, in the scope of my research and my evolution as a scholar, practitioner, artist, whatsoever, I have had, I mean, a huge personal basis has informed everything that I have ended up researching in whatever capacity and in whatever field. And I also think that many times, most of the times actually, we don't talk about our personal journeys as to how we became a scholar of XYZ field. Many times, at least in the fields of the humanities and social sciences, a personal journey is often involved with that. And I'm not saying that you can't be involved with some subject or discipline, and if you don't have a personal story attached to it. But it might be that the subject itself is so fascinating that you're drawn to it without necessarily having any personal background towards it. But in this case, and in the case of children's literature, which is such a distinctive category and yet a very general category, given the fact that it would sort of encapsulate the entire world. All of us as adults were once children. I thought it might be just good to think about the whole subject, the discipline, as I approached it through my interdisciplinary practices as well as artistic practices. So that's what this whole thing is going to be about. And the pathway I'm going to take is pretty much a sort of chronological thing, starting from my childhood to my days in Cambridge and beyond. So so here it goes then. I come from the state of Himachal Pradesh, and that's where my mother comes from. And my father's job, which was in the forest services, was his card was also Himachal Pradesh. And the main place where I grew up in was not Shimla, which I otherwise talk about all the time in my biography, but in my bio notes, but actually in the Kulu Valley. That's where I basically grew up. And the main central picture you see is that of the Kulu Valley with the Beas, the ferocious, beautiful Beas River flowing through it and cutting through it. This is where I spent most of my time. 5 years were in Dehradun. That was also the foothills of the Himalayas, and this is the middle Himalayas. So why I am putting up this photograph here is not only because I'm a photographer, but also because just to highlight the fact that this landscape and the landscape of Himachal Pradesh, the state of Himachal Pradesh in totality, was something with which I associate most fully and most intensely and most passionately. More than anything else, along with the influence of my mother, whose photograph you see on the right. These two influences, I would think, would be my core influences regarding everything, regarding my journey as a scholar, as a practitioner, as an artist, as a thinker. Well, the landscape you can see is something which is anyone who has grown up in the hills and mountains would feel an almost like an innate connection with this kind of a very magnificent sort of a terrain. But along with this, why I've put up a photograph of my mother painting is also because one of the distinctive memories of my childhood, in fact until now itself, is to see Ma practicing her artwork. She's a self-trained artist and craftsperson, and basically putting her heart and soul in literally everything that she does, whether it is from cooking to poetry to dance to painting, whatsoever it is. And so it was her sort of, interdisciplinarity and her joyous approach towards life. Even before I had known the word interdisciplinarity, it was that sort of ethos of creativity and craft that I absorbed as a child. And when I picked up my PhD topic at Cambridge in 2014 or 13, I then realized how much her role was in order to make me the scholar through her, creative practices. And I'm here highlighting a couple of things about craftsmanship. She would often say, right from the beginning of my childhood, even till now, that whatever you do it well for its own sake. There is no higher purpose. You just do things well for their own sake. And that's what craftsmanship is all about. And I will come back to this definition later on in the presentation, but this is something that stayed in my mind way before. The other thing was that while this was a natural landscape and the space of the home was, of course, a sort of a cultural landscape, but through her art and through her understanding of life in all its vivacity and diversity, I think the beginnings of the blurring of the boundary, the artificial boundary that we often put between nature and culture, had already started long time back. And this is again a sort of a philosophical topic that interests me a lot, how nature and culture basically interact together. And on the left, you see also the photograph or the cover of a Ruskin Bond story, arguably the most famous writer in India, writing in English, at least in our genre, the children's literature. And he too grew up in Himachal, Kasauli, in Shimla Hills, where we actually ended up going later on in life. And although in the landscape of Kulu, it didn't have any bookshop, it didn't have any library back then when I was growing up there. Still, the name of Ruskin Bond was something which was quite popular. And I would imagine would be the case across India, at least in the English-speaking population, right? And clearly, you can imagine me making a certain sort of a kind of a connect between Ruskin's Bond's characters and my character and my own sort of personality, because he too was talking about the landscape of the hills in the Himalayas. Okay. Just to say that this is not sort of a wholly nostalgic or romanticized understanding of the Himalayas. I actually, I mean, I would say that I literally feel that the Himalayas are a part of me, to the extent that when I was writing the acknowledgements for my PhD thesis, I decided that before thanking my parents or my supervisor, who was Professor Maria Nikolaeva, I would thank the Himalayas there. And as I was doing that, I was reminded of Terry Pratchett's last 5 books, which were also part of my thesis analysis, in which Tiffany Aching, the main witch, who resides as a farmer as well as a witch of the landscape of chalk. For those of you who have read this thing, right? Pratchett is wonderful at conjuring these connections between landscape being literally a part of your body, and how that sort of an ecological awareness also shapes your practice as a witch and a magician, right? So this is just a sort of flag that I felt a sort of almost like connection between a fictional character and my own when I was thinking about my association with the Himalayas. But that is all for the Kulu Valley. When in I think 2005, I shifted to Delhi University, and till 2010, I did my both BA and MA in English literature. And after that, I got enrolled into the MPhil program at Delhi University. And it was precisely at that moment that my father was transferred to Shimla, which is the capital of the state of Himachal Pradesh, for those of you who don't know. And this was the landscape, more than any other landscape, that literally sort of shook me from inside, I would say, and changed me entirely as a person, as a lover of geography, history, as an artist, whatever you can think of. And despite being in the same state as Kulu, this was a landscape which also changed my understanding of the Himalayas. So Kulu and many other these valleys that you have, Chamba, Kangra, Kashmir, most of the pre-colonial valleys are basically distinguished by the fact that they are all the hill valleys are basically having their towns within the base of the valley. Okay, but it is only with colonization, whether you think of Darjeeling or Mussoorie or Shimla, that whole townships sort of shift towards the top of the ridge. And Shimla being the best example of that, because this also served as a summer capital of the British Raj from 1864 to 1947. And because it had clearly so many remnants of of British architecture, European architecture, and that sort of sensibility of a little England as it was known back then in its heyday still lingered. This was a place that almost, even more than Kulu, it sort of lent itself to a wild imagination, a wild sort of fantastical imagination, and especially to think about Harry Potter, which was the first proper fantasy text that I had read in the Kulu Valley itself. I mean, here were so many buildings and so many markers that would automatically remind me of the sort of terrain that I had read in those British fantasy texts. What I also enjoyed in this landscape is the way it changed according to the seasons, something again which fantasy writers are very good at drawing your attention to. Yeah, and you can see a lot of these British markers and remnants, still relics and all. This is the Viceregal Lodge, which is not arguably, sorry, it is the grandest building of Shimla, and it was made in 1888. Interestingly, this was made in literally like a Scottish castle atop a particular hill called Observatory Hill. And this was readily, I mean, it readily lent itself to an interpretation of an Indian Hogwarts. Okay, and my photography helped me to think and make sense of this sort of amalgamation of imagination and reality that was always going on in my head, right? And this tree that is adjacent to it on the left, I'm sorry, I've not been able to put a full photograph. I would always refer to it as a Whomping Willow. So why I'm saying all of this is not only to sort of flag the romanticized aspects of children's literature, of which we all are aware, but more importantly, to make the point that that sort of critiques the idea, and it is a very visible idea in children's literature studies, or for that matter, even general literature studies, that you cannot understand a text, and children especially can't understand a text if it does not belong to your culture. Okay, that is something that I have always had a little problem with, because the point that many wonderful children's literature critics keep making is that once the text goes into the hands and vision of children, they end up doing all sorts of things with it. Okay, and that's why this definition of Kimberly Reynolds comes to my mind, that children's literature is both a breeding ground and an incubator for innovation. And there are certainly many ordinary children's books, but there are also aspects about writing for children that result in a kind of a wild zone where new ways of writing are explored. And I want you to hold on to this phrase called a kind of a wild zone, because this is the sensibility, this wildness, this unpredictability that keeps coming over and over in the theorization of children's literature. One of my most favorite secondary texts of like analysis of children's literature is a text called "And Britain and the Mystery of Children's Literature" by David Rudd, in which we are all very well aware of how much Britain has been criticized in the last few years regarding her sexist and her racist depictions, etc., etc. But this guy, for those of you again who have not read this thing, does a wonderful, power inflected Foucauldian analysis of the whole sort of genre. But what he also does is that he goes many steps ahead than just being an adult critic of children's literature, and interviews a lot of children about how did they engage with this text, with the texts of Enid Blyton. And it was such a sort of a vindication of my own childhood, because even though I completely understand the importance of these political readings, which are very important, I mean, you can't undermine that thing at all. But I also was very cognizant of the fact that just like Rudd describes how children would give him testimonies about sitting with their brothers and sisters under a blanket and reading some passages with a torch on, and just drooling about the food depictions and all. And the point therefore that he was trying to make was that in this literature, child interviews took exception to modern editors applying politically correct revisions of that thing, right? And this is something that was, and he was interviewing just students and children from Britain, but it was a vindication also because I was exactly engaging with these texts exactly in the way that his participants were telling him about. So the point being that as adult critics, we end up assuming a lot on part of what and how children think. Yeah, that's a very fundamental thing, which we are masters of forgetting and overlooking because we want to, privilege the act of critical reading and critical analysis to the detriment of the actual reality that exists, right? The phenomenological reality that exists. Okay. So what happened then was that I became so attracted and completely got in love with Shimla that I decided that for my MPhil, which at that time in Indian universities was considered as the bridge degree between your master's and your PhD, right? Now, under the new education policy, it has been completely done away with. So it's no longer there. But at that time, and I'm speaking of 2009, 10, 11, you did an MPhil if you wanted to do a higher research. And that was also the first degree in which you wrote a proper dissertation, 20,000 words long. So I was under Professor Uday Kumar, who is now at JNU. And I told him that I want to write a thesis on Shimla, which kind of fell within South Asian literature research. And he said, yes, definitely. And I had a blast of a time, thinking through colonial literature, colonial travel literature, colonial paintings and all, and how the Britishers basically ended up interpreting and thinking about Shimla in their travel writings. That's what my MPhil thesis was. But along with it, given my fascination with Harry Potter and other British fantasy texts, I was very, very sure. And I mean, this was a feeling that was, almost sort of become stronger and stronger, that I had to do something in fantasy literature as well. It just became a huge desire. On the other hand, I also knew that there was almost no place back then in the country where I could actually do something like that. True, there was some analysis, and textual analysis, and some people say existing and doing work on, say, Bengali children's literature and some other folk literatures of, say, South India and the west of India, and some people focusing on, say, the politics of the early comic series in India, most famously the Amar Chitra Katha, but that was pretty much it. The scope of researching children's literature, especially outside that of India, I mean, British fantasy literature, was something that was kind of a no-no, and there was no ecosystem for doing that. And that is what then made me apply to outside. And I was also very sure that I had to go to Britain, and I didn't apply it anywhere in the States. And that's an advice that I would never give now to anyone, because it's filled with risk. I was just very lucky, I would say, and fortunate that one university, Oxford, rejected me and another accepted me. So that is something that happened. But as that was happening, and as I was also applying for scholarships within India. And this is an important point, because, and I'm saying this because many times we forget to be self-reflexive regarding our own field. We will be self-reflexive and critical and all regarding the texts that we are interpreting. But how does our own field of research get shaped by all kinds of biases, prejudices, ideas, ideologies, something that we don't often discuss? Okay. And that's why I'm talking about this thing. So the three scholarship bodies, one was from the MHRD and two other were from, I think, some private institutions, to which, none of which ultimately ended up giving me a scholarship. It was from outside. All of them questioned me, why do you want to change your field to children's literature? Yeah. Why are you not continuing your work on South Asian travel literature or colonial literature, or city-based literature and all? And my simple answer was that I'm interested in both of them, and the second thing, that I felt pretty confident, especially after Uday's supervision, that I could carry on doing the work of Shimla in my own capacity. But in order to launch into a formal study of children's literature, I really, really needed a whole ecosystem that could help me think about a subject of which there was almost no idea in India, barring a couple of texts, say Alice in Wonderland and one or two other things in the popular culture paper that we had at Delhi University. That was it. And yet it just became very hard for me to defend this. It almost felt like I'm doing a crime by not taking forward something related to India, yeah, for my PhD. And I can name, I mean, from whatever I know about my fellow scholars, I can name very few scholars from India who did not end up researching Indian literature when they went for their PhDs outside, or something to do with India or South Asia. Okay. And interestingly, if you think about how this all sort of pans out in the job market, having lived at so many places, both in the US and Germany and and USA. I've been quite struck by the fact that if you are from South Asia, you are expected to be a historian or an expert of South Asia first and foremost, right? And as much as I am all for critical insider versus critical outsider kind of debate and all, I really don't think so that just by being some, belonging to South Asia, that gives you all the legitimacy to research only about South Asia. That seems to me to be a very reductive and a very limited sort of reasoning. Anyway, but this is a bias that I'm trying to point out remains throughout, your sort of academic career. And when finally I did get the opportunity in Cambridge and I joined the Center for Research in Children's Literature for my second MPhil and then eventually for my PhD, there too were different kinds of biases. So I learned that I first applied to the English department at Cambridge, who told me point blankly that they don't entertain research proposals on fantasy literature. But they were kind enough to direct me to the Center for Children's Literature, which actually ended up being at the Faculty of Education. So this was a new learning for me, which is that either Centers for Children's Literature was standing independently, say at Roehampton or at Newcastle or at Cambridge. But at Cambridge and at several other places, they were accommodated within faculties of education and sometimes within faculties of sociology. And the reason is simple, that the term children's literature immediately connotes a certain sort of a sociological understanding of childhood, right? That's the first sort of thing that comes to the mind, and it's understandable, therefore. However, there is another branch within the study of children's literature slash fantasy literature slash science fiction, which I would think of as their branch disciplines, which is that, for people who don't want to do a sociological analysis. So, for instance, my work had nothing to do with the sociology of childhood. It was pretty much a desk-based research, as I would have done in any English literature department. Okay. So these are the kind of sort of multiple layers of hierarchies and biases and ways in which the ambiguity of the space of children's literature as a subject became quite sort of evident to me. And when I would say something like I do fantasy literature, that connoted even more of a lowly thing than, say, a word like children's literature did. And that's simply because, I mean, it is not held to be a very big genre. One of the main reasons being that it is considered to be genre fiction. So it is considered to be a very sort of a formulaic kind of a thing, right? And I actually did not want to think of fantasy as only belonging to children's literature. As all of us know, it is very much of a crossover genre. It is not a genre only related to children's literature. So, for instance, Tolkien's Hobbit immediately qualifies as children's literature, but Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is not children's literature in the conventional sense of the term, right? So, and I was trying to look at fantasy literature, and it it also became quite apparent to me that a Marquez and Murakami would immediately be chosen over a Pratchett or a Pullman, right? Um, Despite the fact that I would think of all of these four people as absolute literary geniuses, two of them writing in the magical realist tradition, two of them writing in this, solid fantasy tradition, right? But there is something about magical reality. The idea of reality is very, very important to the study of literature, that somehow that is deemed as having some sort of a better or a greater literary value than something like this. Okay. So this is something that I wanted to flag at the very beginning. And I want also have a little quotation here by my favorite Indian social commentator, Santosh Desai, who writes this, that our love of hierarchy is not as restricted to official dome alone. He's talking about the Indian situation. To the Indian mind, the world of knowledge is divided into three broad categories: science, commerce, and arts. And in the intricate algebra of educational options, science is the undisputed leader, towering above the nondescript commerce and then the cowering arts. Nobody questions this absurd practice. It is also unclear as to what forms the basis of this hierarchy, right? So the point being, therefore, then that this sense of a hierarchization of disciplines is something which begins right from childhood onwards, and it then sort of broadens and sort of flourishes in multiple permutations and combinations as you grow up and end up being at the university. So while all of this cast a certain sort of an ambiguous relationship to the subject, when I reached in Cambridge, what I was not at all ambiguous about the fact was simply that this was undoubtedly, in my view, that's the best thing to happen to me. And this is the ethos, and that was not only because of the wonderful professors and other great colleagues that I had, but that I sensed, and on an almost like in on an everyday level, and definitely on occasions of like celebrations and festivals and all, that this place, this Center for Children's Literature, which was half based in my college, Homerton College, of whose great hall you see here, and half based in this modern building of the Faculty of Education, which is just adjacent to it. This center was trying its level best to be as creative and as celebratory about the discipline of children's literature. And I must say that this sense of celebration and joy is, in my view, very, very crucial to giving a certain dignity to the subject that you are studying, which is not to say that I'm frowning on on a serious study of literature, of general literature, or of realist literature, and or I'm frowning on the very fact, or I'm sort of being critical of the idea of seriousness. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying that there has to be a way in which we bring back joy and pleasure to the reading of literature, which is something that a lot of theory has sort of been arguing against for several decades. And again, I want to qualify this by saying that I absolutely love theory. I would, if I were to teach something in the university, I mean, theory would be one of my favorite subjects. Okay, it is just the way it has been used in a very instrumentalized and a reductive manner that sort of looks down upon the sense of attachment, joy and pleasure, aesthetics, beauty, all those kind of things that form the core of our general reading experience. That's what I'm fundamentally against. And a place like Center for Children's Literature was really trying to sort of bring back and think about the whole field of children's writing, fantasy writing, and all through everyday things. So from making everything from like cupcakes inspired by Harry Potter to hosting like conferences and all around the themes of Alice in Wonderland and so on and so forth. This was like the 150th anniversary of Alice in Wonderland, which we celebrated at Homerton across 5 days. And we had a proper academic conference, but we also had a lot of these kind of things. And I want to draw your attention to the photograph on the right, which is basically my supervisor, who is sitting on a chair inspired by the Alice texts. And there is a particular tradition in Oxbridge that you speak a couple of words in Latin in the form of a grace before the formal meal begins. It's like a Christian prayer thing. And I still remember that I was sitting here. We were all part of the organization committee, and despite Cambridge being an elite place and all the sort of accusations that it sort of keeps receiving, it one of my most cherished moments of those days was that how some kind of a little acts of subversion were constantly going on. So that particular grace that Maria Nikolaeva spoke that day was literally a reading of the whole Jabberwocky poem from the Alice in Wonderland text, which is complete gibberish and means nothing, right? But at another level, it also ends up completely upturning the whole spiritual / religious meaning of the conventional grace in Latin, and yet giving a certain different kind of almost a different kind of a holistic, wholesome appeal to the whole environment, right? So that's the joy and ethos I'm trying to talk about. That this, for me at least, was not at all superficial. It was very much important and integral to the study of my field. And I'm also saying this as a critique of this kind of tendency within literary criticism to look down upon what I was just saying, to look down upon ideas of pleasure, ideas of aesthetics. Two essays on the left come to my mind. They're brilliant works, and I would strongly recommend all of you to read that. One is by Sumana Roy, who teaches in Ashoka, Beyond the Guilt Tax. It's a wonderful piece on how students have become so suspicious of the act of pleasure and aesthetics and beauty. And the other one is by John Baskin in the same magazine, online magazine. It's called On the Hatred of Literature, where he argues that as I grew up into a literature scholar in one of those posh US colleges, universities, it became evident to me that the more detached and the more the more sort of almost like a hatred I assume towards a text, the more critically attuned I would be considered to be. And he is then writing this article on against this tendency. Then there are several other people like Jane Bennett, Derek Attridge, Stephen Connor, Ellen Scurry, most importantly, and Rita Felsky. All of these people have also been talking against this sort of a reductive, instrumentalized sensibility regarding just using theory as a as a tool that you can automatically apply, and in order to sort of gain results. Whereas the point of literature is that the literature is not mathematics. 2 plus 2 is never 5. Four in literature, right? It is either 5 or something else. So all of these kind of works are also sort of written in towards that sensibility of thinking. The other thing that helped me in Cambridge and continues to this day was my photography. I am not trained as a photographer, but it was such an inspiring place, just like the Himalayas, that I was also finding ways to understand my discipline through the visual, through the visual lens. And because the idea of fantasy and the idea of children's literature always has a very distinct, a vivacious sort of a vitality, a visual vitality, and a material vitality to it. One of the exhibitions that I ended up organizing in Homerton at the Faculty of Education was called Between the Real and the Imagined: The Spaces of Fantasy, in which I basically curated many of my photographs of Oxford and Cambridge through the lens of fantasy literature. And yet, on the other hand, my work on Shimla in South Asia was also continuing simultaneously. So this was an exhibition that I did at the University of Durham, where I am still associated as a visiting faculty. And there I teach a course on, I'm on a course on heritage conservation, it's very distinct from this. But the reason why I've put both of these two things together is that I, as a growing scholar and practitioner, never made any distinction that the thing on the right is more serious and the thing on the left is less serious. For me, I've been very, very sure that you can bring a certain sort of seriousness, creativity, and appreciation to any subject, whether it is William Shakespeare or Wordsworth or a children's literature text or whatsoever it is. So this was a kind of a sensibility. Mine was a sensibility that was constantly sort of hovering between imagination and reality, not only in as a practitioner of literature, but also as a practitioner of the visual arts. And finally, what I was most lucky with was having a great supervisor, with whom I had innumerable disagreements, to the point that I reached a particular stage where it was like, it's just not going ahead at all. But, and given the fact that she was coming from a semiotic tradition, she's Maria Nikolaeva, she's just one of the best, semioticians I've come across and structuralist thinkers of children's literature, whereas my sensibility more leans to the post-structuralist school of thought, Derrida, Deleuze, and all those all those people. But where we did come together was in our appreciation of nature and landscape, and in our appreciation of materiality. So a lot of my supervisions actually took place in these kind of pathways, which were there in the college grounds itself. And it was also very instructive for me to see Maria as one of the world's leading dollhouse makers. So she's an extraordinary miniaturist, and to see that sort of a sensibility that was clearly, a lot of it was inspired from picture books, from children's books and all, right? But also a lot of it had to do with her own interests in dollhouse making. So you can already see that landscape and materiality were two aspects of research which sort of just kept coming together as I was evolving into the student. Okay, now to a bit more serious and theoretical part of it. So as I was saying with that Kimberly Reynolds quote as well, that she uses the word wild zone. And Nodelman and Nikolaeva are some of the earliest critics to talk about what children's literature is about. It's about innocence and experience. It's about adult normativity, or etonormativity, what Nikolaeva calls, right? Which governs the way children's literature has been patterned. But her student, Clementine Beauvoir, one of my seniors at Cambridge, she wrote this brilliant book called The Mighty Child, in which she says that we must avoid the slip from normative to domination. And then she goes on to state that children's literature is not about systemic disempowerment of the child, but about the mighty child. It is pleasurable as long as it remains thrown forth in movement, as long as the teachings of experience are longed for, but without quite being there, as long as it remains unpredictable. So this kind of matches, and parallels that idea of the wildness of this particular field of literature, where things are always, or many times, most of the times, they're quite unpredictable. You never quite know, what surprise you might get. And similarly, someone like Louise Joy, who was also teaching, in my at my center, she goes on to define children's literature as, she wants to think about literary texts aimed at a child audience. They might operate both didactically and aesthetically by viewing the critical reading as a united kind of work and play. So again, the distinction between fun and seriousness doesn't exist within this thing. Both these things, both these aspects actually go together, right? But my favorite theorists of children's literature, and the two books that are readily, um, I readily recommend to anyone who asks me where should we start reading about children's literature, are these two books by Jerry Griswold and Catherine Rundle. Catherine Rundle is by far my favorite contemporary children's writer, just a phenomenal writer in 1,000 ways. And this little essay, I think, was first published in The Guardian in some form, and then it was, republished in a book form. And as you can see from the title itself, she thinks about children's fiction as, so the best children's fiction helps us refine things we may not even know we have lost, taking us back to a time when new discoveries came daily. And again, this idea of something about to happen, the novelty of discovery is something which is very inherent to children's literature, and especially to that of fantasy. Jerry Griswold writes this beautiful book called Feeling Like a Kid, in which he enumerates these 5 aspects that determine the phenomenological quality of a children's text, which is snugness, scariness, smallness, lightness, and aliveness. And I really like this quote when he says that the genre of children's literature reflects the distribution of consciousness and the child's feeling that the world is alive. So aliveness is something that somehow, aliveness, wonder, beauty, aesthetics, those kind of things were something which I kept coming back to. And ultimately, that somehow shaped my PhD topic as well, which was about making. Now, going back to that first photograph of my mother and other things that I talked about, the one thing that drew me to fantasy literature was its madeness, by which I basically mean, a lot of people have talked about this in terms of world building, right? Secondary worlds, parallel worlds. How do we imagine completely unrealistic worlds in a realistic format? So I'm not the first person to talk about this kind of subject. However, I wanted to take the discussion a bit forward by specifically looking at the maker figure. What to my mind distinguished, even if very loosely, the whole corpus of fantasy literature from, say, vis-a-vis a big corpus of realist literature, was that somehow fantasy literature, and the best of fantasy literature, kept having these maker figures over and over and over and over, right? And therefore the references of, phrases like a dwarf made gem, elf made sword, this made something, right? This thing about madeness of something is it almost becomes not a metaphor, but a kind of a theme within the entirety of fantasy literature. The Lord of the Rings is ultimately about destroying the ring that was made by Sauron, right? Harry Potter it's all about makers of magic, because all of them are witches and wizards, but ultimately it becomes a whole text about, how do you destroy products of bad making, which are the 7 material products, the Horcruxes and all. So this notion of inherent creativity and craft is something which I worked towards, and I ended up coining a certain phrase called the aesthetic of making after my supervisor's work, which is one of her works called Aesthetic Approaches to Children's Literature, in which she devotes, all of her chapters are like aesthetic of content, aesthetic of form, aesthetic of space, aesthetic of character, etc., etc., etc. And those together make children's literature. But and from here, I was therefore inspired to think that perhaps there is something like the aesthetic of making that can help us better appreciate the sense of craftsmanship and craftedness of fantasy that remains. Yeah, and that also lends a certain kind of a specific kind of wonder or wondrous aliveness to the whole ethos of the subject. Okay, and I'll be exemplifying it so it will become more clear. The photograph and the picture here is an illustration of Fëanor, the creator of Silmarils, which come in the Silmarillion, which is Tolkien's the major legendarium, which happens 2 to 3 ages before the events of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, right? Um, so this is what I ended up looking at. How does making and craftsmanship and materiality that results out of that making, how do all of these things basically contribute to the feeling of wonder? Yeah. And these are always these acts of making and associating with materiality, etc., they're always taking place within a particularized landscape, whether it is a landscape of learning, say a school like Hogwarts, or it is a workshop or whatsoever. I was also very interested with fantasy, the fact that um, that so much of magic that was depicted here in texts after texts had to be learned. And herein I found a kind of a particular paradox of fantasy literature, which is that on the one hand, almost all fantasy is devoted to the depiction of worlds that don't exist. Yeah, depiction of magic that doesn't exist in the real world. And yet when that magic does get existed, I mean, this does get made into shaped into being by fantasy writers, many of them make a point of not treating it as a light subject, but treating it in terms of a skill, which is to say that magic has to be learned as a skill. It is not that you get something magical and you become a magician, right? And therefore you have the prominence of workshops, universities, schools. These 3 4 kind of institutions, they keep proliferating, right from Ursula Le Guin to J.K. Rowling to Terry Pratchett. They just keep the whole sort of ethos of learning becomes very, very important in order to even think about magic. And the second thing that becomes important is the human body. This also I find extremely fascinating, because you're not obliged to take the human body into consideration. And sure enough, we have thousands of animal characters and fictional characters proliferating throughout the genre. And yet when somehow fantasy that can't do without the prominence of senses, and without the prominence of especially the work of the hand. So if you look at even fantasy films, or web series and all, you will see how strongly do producers and directors focus on the movement of the hand. Like the hand keeps reappearing again and again, whether it is in the construction or the use of magic, or of say Wands, or whether it is say Lev Grossman's The Magicians, that's an American fantasy series, whether it is Tamara Pierce's fantasies. The hand is something which is the most human of all, human of all organs. So essentially, then my thesis therefore drew me and pushed me towards an understanding of the philosophy of what does it mean to make things by hand and perform things by hand in the realm of fantasy. So here there are like 3 examples. One is by William Morris, who was the leader of the arts and crafts movement, late 19th century. Many of you would be knowing it. It was a movement that began as a counter movement to the ethos of industrialization, and he spoke, wrote, made relentlessly with hands, and talked about the importance of craft and doing things with hands. And he's also credited as the first fantasy writer in Britain who made these elaborate secondary worlds in the English novel form for the first time. And it is he who ends up influencing Tolkien the most to write his Lord of the Rings. So interestingly, Morris hardly ever uses overt or explicit magical forces. Okay. But much of his magic actually derives from the fact that most of his characters are actually craftspeople. Okay, so the utopian societies that he's depicting are utopian precisely because they are societies that are made with hands. And on the other hand, pun intended, the villains are those who don't appreciate this kind of a handwork. So here's, for instance, a passage talking about the villainy of the villains. They had no mind to till the teeming earth, or to sit at the hulum or the hammer in the spithy. Wretched and befouled was their well-built house, and hangings rent away. The goodly painted walls daubed and smeared with wicked tokens of alien murderers, etc., etc., etc. Right? So you can completely see that the violence or the evil derives from the simple fact that these people don't appreciate a good handmade product, whether it is architecture, whether it is object. Similarly, in The Hobbit, the dragon Smog, who is the main villain, and he goes on to say that dragons steal gold and jewels. They never enjoy a brass ring of it. They hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, and though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, they can't make a thing for themselves. So again, the villainy and the evil of dragons derives from the simple fact that they can't make things from themselves, and that theirs is a completely sort of a capitalistic vision towards materiality. And then you have C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, which is the prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where again, when Aslan the Lion, he makes his new universe, what he tells a couple of dwarfs and moles is to start making a crown for the king and the queen. Fire started blazing and the billows were roaring and the gold was melting and hammers were clinking. How those dwarfs loved their work. And why, again, from like continuing from my previous discussion, the idea of joy is so central here, because William Morris, as someone working in the thick of industrialism, was very, very particular about the fact that labor, yes, is important, but labor filled with joy is most important. Yeah. And interestingly, for some strange reason, for all of my BA and MA, I had never heard of his name. So, as much as I think that reading Marx is incredibly important for multiple reasons, I also think that, it is very, very crucial to come to terms with people like Morris, like John Ruskin, and the whole sort of panoply of writers like them, who are not only theorizing in a sort of a kind of a verbose language about what labor is, what this is, but they're also constantly talking about the value and the importance of pleasure and skill when they're talking about labor. Yeah, which is something that we see in fantasy again and again. My favorite example is, however, the long example comes from Philip Pullman's final book, The Amber Spyglass. Again, if you look at just the titles of the three, according to me, this is the best last great fantasy work of the 20th century. And it is undoubtedly just a masterpiece in numerous ways. A fabulous reworking of John Milton's Paradise Lost, but much more than that as well. So if you look at just the names of the titles of these books as well, see that they are all derived from objects. And I think it is safe to say that if you pick around 100 books of fantasy, random books, right, and 100 realism books, you would find many more books from the fantasy genre having the object name in the title, right, than in the realist novel. So Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the Amber Spyglass, yeah, the Golden Compass, the Subtle Knife, Shannara's and the Sword, the Magician's Chair, so on and so forth. They are just innumerable objects that end up determining the materiality and the ethos of fantasy worlds again and again. In the third book by Philip Pullman, which is the final book as well, there's a beautiful parallel world filled with elephant-like creatures called the Malefa. And there is a scientist called Mary Malone, and she enters there. She doesn't quite know what to do, but this is a very idyllic society that Pullman goes in great. I've just mentioned one paragraph, but Pullman goes in great detail to enumerate how they did work well. And Pullman is hugely inspired from the arts and crafts movement sensibility as well, right? So here is Mary observing these Mulefa people doing things well for their own sake. Little by little, Mary came to see that the way that everything was linked together in the Mulefa world. They knew the location of every herd of grazers, every stand of real trees, every clump of sweet grass, and they discussed their well-being and fate, and nothing was wasted in their world. Mary watched their everyday work. With pleasure, she felt at seeing anything done well. And this is why I put that photograph of my mother.
If I could interrupt you for a minute, but
Yes.
we're running at 50 minutes now.
Okay. I have just two or three slides more, and I'll end it here. So thank you for letting me know. So this is why I'd also, put my mother's photograph up like back there. Now you get the sense and the connection, right? That the pleasure of seeing something well is a huge inspiration in its own sense, right? And the two people that I was leaning on in order to theorize my thesis were a sociologist called Richard Sennett, who is very famous in his own field, and an anthropologist called Tim Ingold, who too is one of the top names in his field. Interestingly, when I started working on this project, none of these two thinkers had ever been utilized within the realm of fantasy literature research, or for that matter, even children's literature research. So the novelty of the project therefore pushed me to go beyond, beyond the realm of literary criticism and assimilate influences from disciplines that had not been till then at least been sort of drawn into the realm of literary children's literature research. Okay. um, this is all examples from the West. Even in the case of contemporary Indian fantasy writing as well as the contemporary Indian fantasy mythology, it's very interesting to see that the return, or not the return, but the exploration of the maker figure and a new kind of material consciousness is quite evident. So if you look at the first adaptation of Mahabharata, which happened in 1988, the whole Mahabharata was narrated by a disembodied figure of the time, the Wheel of Time, right? All of us remember this thing. In the 2013 version, which for some reason many people trashed, but I thought it was a brilliant take on the whole subject. It is Krishna who becomes the main narrator. And it is not that he ends up sermonizing over and over in a completely sort of detached kind of a mood. Almost every other episode would have him doing something with his hands, whether it is weaving, whether it is making a pot, whether it is doing something. So basically, thinking about the philosophy of life through this material domain of craftsmanship. And my favorite contemporary Indian English fantasy series is by someone called Giti Chandra, which is again set in contemporary India and contemporary Europe and America. And here too, she thinks of a lot of maker figures. Even musicians and other kind of artists and all are shown as people who have to learn their powers in order to go ahead and act well. Okay, the the second last thing, what I wanted to tell you about, and I won't go into details in this thing, that the while the first part of my thesis was about human making, the second part of my thesis was actually about, it was a kind of a reversal of what I had argued in the first part, which is that almost every fantasy text and fantasy universe ends up having objects which at some or the other point develop a sentience of their own, to the extent that they will overwhelm the agency of the human maker or the human performer, right? Now, Bill Brown, who is one of the major figures in think theory, and many people quote him, he says this about things, that we begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us, when the drill breaks, when the car stalls, then it is that we recognize what the thingness of a thing is about. But in fantasy, I kind of disagree with this thing, because in fantasy literature, the thingness of things doesn't depend upon whether it breaks or not. The thingness of things is something which actually doesn't have an end. Point being, an example being the painting in Harry Potter. It has always struck me as something quite a brilliant sort of an artifact, because a painting is never actually complete in Harry Potter. The very fact that they are always alive, the very fact that they are constantly talking, moving, crossing corridors, etc., means that there is no end to their objectness as such, right? Something like the map as well, and it's very much a crafted object by those three makers, and yet the map ends up developing a certain interiority of its own, which the biggest example of which we find is when the room of requirement disappears, and in reality it also disappears on the map, which means to, yeah, which goes on to show that there's almost like a pact of interiority between different material domains within the space of Hogwarts, right? And this is where I think fantasy literature and children's literature in general sort of goes many steps ahead than what realistic literature does. All right. In terms, these are my articles. I can send it to you, whatever I've written and published till now. And in terms of a coda, I just wanted to end by saying that while researching children's literature and fantasy literature at Cambridge, I was introduced for the first time to the genre of nature writing, which is something that I had not heard of before. We did have people like Jim Corbett, Ruskin Bond, Salim Ali, just 4 or 5 people in India who would be thought of as Indian nature writers, M. Krishnan, who would be thought of as Indian nature writers. But it was while researching children's literature and fantasy literature that I ended up also, getting introduced to this field. And most of you would be aware of Robert Macfarlane and many other people who are the sort of key writers in this. And as I started reading that genre, it struck to me as a kind of a wondrous thing again, that many of these fantasy writers also ended up relying heavily on, many of these nature writers also ended up relying heavily on fantasy writing in order to theorize about their work, right? To the extent that the new editions of Susan Cooper's fantasy books are written by Robert McFarlane, who otherwise is a nature writer. Okay. And this is my first book. This is finally the final slide. When I wrote my first book, which was in 2021, it was a commissioned work as part of a larger global arts project running from Tasmania called the Lost Rocks Project, under which 40 writers from all over the world were supposed to write books inspired by rocks, metals, and minerals. Okay, all right. And my rock that they gave me was fossil. And I ended up writing a whole series of speculative sort of poems and all on the Himalayas. But the final poem, which was about actually a real fossil of a whale that was found in Shimla Hills in 1999, was partly inspired by Terry Pratchett's book, the final book by Terry Pratchett, The Shepherd's Crown, where Tiffany Aching, actually the main protagonist, actually ends up deriving all her power through a particular fossil, which she gets as an heirloom from her grandmother, and she wears it around her neck. All right, and that's precisely what gives her, like, that basically serves as a wonderful link between landscape and materiality and magic, all of that together, right? So while this book Fossil was not a fantasy book novel by any measure, why I wanted to end with this particular slide was that once you become, drawn to the wonder of children's literature, fantasy literature, science fiction, whatever you want to call it, um, that thing never becomes an end in itself. It will almost become like what Wordsworth calls a spot of time, right? In your mind. So that even when you are researching a real world environment, like I was researching the Himalayas for this particular book, that thing remains a permanent source of inspiration and wonder. And I think that is where the importance of children's literature and fantasy literature ultimately lies. All right. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking this extra time. Thank you.
That was, I don't actually have words how to explain. I suppose my 4 or 5 pages of notes will have to do the explaining for me.
Okay. Sorry for taking the time, but I just have to be sorry about
There
this.
was so much that you spoke about, and it's going to take a while, I think, for all of us to unravel all those threads. But we do have some questions that are coming
Yeah.
up in the chat. But
Yeah,
before
good.
I get to those questions, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, something in between. But you were talking about the aliveness of objects in a few slides ago, and I was thinking that in some regards, whether that be in children's literature studies or in how children are viewed as social beings, children are also to an extent viewed as an object who are
Right.
worked upon and created by the former children, adults, and who then also at some point develop their own sense of agency. So, I mean, that's something I will think about, but would you have any comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, see, first and foremost, if you were looking at it from a very say post-colonial point of view, Ashish Nandi and many other sociologists have written about this thing, that how the colonizers thought about the whole Indian polity. Well, that time it was not a whole political polity, but like the whole Indian civilization as children. Yeah, meaning that children to be worked upon by the colonials because they do not know how to live by themselves. So that is one. So that idea of colonization and the colonized child is something which has been quite prevalent in sociological analysis and literary analysis for quite some time. And you're absolutely right that the child is looked at as many times as an object, especially in our society like India, which is such a hierarchized society in multiple ways. That's also the reason why I quoted my supervisor Maria Nikolaeva's concept heteronormativity, which is, I think, it's just one of the best concepts ever given in children's literature criticism, that just like we have heteronormativity or whatever it is, the fact that she is able to think about the fact that heteronormativity is something that determines this genre is very important. Why? Because this is perhaps the only literary genre which is not, largely speaking, not written by the people it is intended for. It is written by adults after they have already transitioned from innocence to experience, right? And that's where the problem, I mean, it's not a problem, but that's where the biases also lie. Yeah, how do we identify the control and the spread of heteronormativity within children's literature. But I would also side with the second quote I had on the same slide by Clementine Bouvier, who wrote this book called The Mighty Child, which I cited as well. That it is not that just because someone is in power that you end up become objectified. And this is the point that I really, really want to emphasize. And this is what also links to the larger point on the reductionist approach towards literary theory, right? That just because you have a Foucauldian paradigm of power and oppression, you apply power and everyone gets oppressed, and this is the end of the universe. This is unfortunately a lot of postcolonial scholars and a lot of other kind of scholars also end up working in these kind of binary ways, to the extent they don't, and don't try to think through the interstices that always exist, some sort of an agency, or it might not be construed even as an agency, but in terms of an emotion or as an affect that refuses to bow down to the larger rubric of power. That I think is equally important as it is important to think about the objectification, which in my view is never necessarily entirely complete. Yeah, so these two things kind of both go together, I feel. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. Like I said, I'm going to be thinking about this. If it comes to that, I will contact you later to discuss this further with you.
All of you,
we
please.
do have questions in the chat. I will get to them. But first, I would like to thank Professor Neena Goga for sending us, for linking in the chat an article by Professor Margaret McKay in the Children's Literature Association blog. Please, I urge everyone to go and read that article. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And the questions, there are lots of questions. Wait,
please.
why is my scroll button not working? Bindu Shri has asked multiple questions actually. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask them yourself, or would you prefer us to read the questions out?
Is she there or?
I'm not sure. I will read them out. She asks, as you have mentioned, children's literature is much more than entertainment. It's also a great philosophy, entailing like Marx and so. Can we relate this to magical realism and its importance here? I'll list all the questions out and you can answer them at your convenience. How would you define the meaning between magical reality shown in the movies of children's literature that can be animated as well, in terms of contradicting or satirizing or portraying the reality of social norms? And she has a final question, I think. Yes, and children's literature is generally connected or likely to study with archetypes. How would you throw a light of studying them beyond archetypal study, but more contemporary related narratives? Okay.
Okay, I'll have to reread all of them because they're very big and massive questions, but I'll just answer them as briefly as possible. The first, I think you didn't read out, right? How does magical reality, how can far it be related, linked to reality?
The second question was also the same question, so I just read the second one.
Okay, yeah. See, this is where creativity and craft comes in, to be very precise, to be very not precise, but there can be no precision about these kind of answers because much of them are they rely on speculation as well. But magical reality and reality, at least in my mind, are always linked. Say that one quote that happens at the end in the King's Cross episode in final book in Harry Potter, right? When Dumbledore says that just because it is happening inside your head, why do you think it is not real? That's the most, like, that's basically the crux of the whole of Harry Potter thing, right? When he dies and he doesn't die, and this is the final question he asks his figure, right? The mentor figure, Dumbledore. Is this, whatever is happening, is this real? If it's happening inside my head? And that's how he responds to it, that just because it is happening inside your head, why do you think it is not real? And I think that pretty much answers this question. Even when I, or for that matter, anyone is working at something or looking at something, perceiving something, hearing a piece of music, eating something, interacting with something, all acts related to the act of perception, yeah, or senses. Our mind is always working in ways more than one. So I think the question therefore should be, what exactly is reality? Because all philosophers would differ from each other. What is reality? There is nothing like objective reality. You can talk about facts and figures, yes, But see, one of the things that I like doing with my one of the exercises that I like doing with my students often is that I often ask them, all right, you three people, basically when I was tutoring at Cambridge, and they were like groups of 3 and 4, and I would just ask them, all four of you have come through the same door to this particular table and you have sat down. Just describe within 5 lines what happened during that passage, because all four, 5 of you have had the same experience. And everyone would talk of a different thing, despite the fact that nothing eventful happened there. Why? Because the way we think about language, the way we perceive language, the way we use language, the way we sense the world, whether it is through touch, smell, taste, imagination, all the kinds of things, they are all subjective at one particular level, right? So what exactly defines a real reality versus what exactly defines a magical reality is always up for debate. There can never be a single answer to this. Yes, within the realm of literature, when an author is saying that he flew from London to Hogwarts, clearly London is referring to the primary world and Hogwarts is referring to the secondary world. But even there, the primary world London, as much as it is related to the real London that we know of, it is not exactly the real London. To the extent that Tony Blair once said in the parliament that I'm still waiting for the Minister of Magic to come and enter my office. That's what he said, right? Because that's what happens in the 6th book in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, right? So I often like to think about the word reality as inherently differentiated, inherently multi-layered. You can keep on going experimenting with it, and especially if you look at from an artistic point of view, then of course there's no end to it, absolutely no end to it, right? The other thing about magical realism is that, I mean, there's one key distinction between magical realism and fantasy writing is simply that magic realist texts and fantasy texts, while they both can be clubbed together in the larger rubric of speculative fiction, just like you can also rope in science fiction, which many people actually do. The one difference is that the element of surprise or or that sort of distanciation that exists in fantasy, that doesn't exist so much in a magic realist text. So for instance, a Murakami novel or a Marquez novel, fish can fall from the sky or flowers can fall from the sky without sort of disturbing anyone. Yeah, it's like a normal sort of an occurrence. That is what magic realism is. Or in Rushdie as well, these kind of events, they keep happening. In a fantasy novel, especially from a primary world point of view, that sense of magic would always carry a certain conscious sense of strangeness, wonder, surprise, whatever it is, right? That's where, and I think I should end at this, because I guess I have kind of answered these two three questions, right?
We have one more question. This is from Gayatri Lakshmi. I find one thing common in every genre of children's literature, that is children doing adventurous and impossible things beyond their age and ability. The famous 5. How can it be understood and interpreted?
Impossible things, and how can we yeah, see, it's just it's inviting you to be imaginative, right? Like, first and foremost, all children's literature is inviting you to be to be imaginative yourself, to stretch your imagination, so that you yourself are not curtailed or contained or limited by your understanding of what understanding and interpretation actually means. When you make a question like this, how can it be understood and interpreted, there is a sense of finality that I sense in this kind of question. Whereas the fact of the matter is that there is no final. That was my point of showing all of those definitions in the beginning as well. That sense of finality that we look for, especially if we are trained only to read realistic literature or to read things in the realistic mode of being, right? Then we will constantly keep coming that this should not be there, and that, it's something that also determines our relationship to cinema, right? So a Satyajit Ray or Shyam Benegal is more realistic than a Sanjay Leela Bhansali is, because he is constantly twisting and turning with reality. And yet for me, Bhansali remains one of the greatest filmmakers of India, precisely for this reason, that he's constantly tweaking and twisting, and yet also deriving something from history, something from the everyday politics. Even when you talk about a Ray or a Benegal and think about them as realistic, or say, even if you think about documentary as realistic, nothing is actually entirely realistic. When you bring a camera in front of the scene, and when a documentary filmmaker, I have a couple of my friends who are making excellent documentaries and all, just talk to them and they will always say, oh, we ended up recording 150 hours of footage, and that all eventually went into 1.5 hours of filmmaking. Now, the fact that you have reduced from 150 hours to 1.5 hours of final documentary filmmaking means that you have also used your own creative consciousness to tweak and, suit the narrative that you want to tell. And this is my issue with using the word reality and realism in an almost sort of an objective, self-explanatory fashion, because to my mind, it is not self-explanatory. It just isn't self-explanatory. To come back to this question, I don't think so. It needs to be understood or interpreted in some very realistic, objective manner. I think, as I was saying, as David Rudd also says in his analysis of Enid Blyton and all, it just gives you a flight of fancy, and children might just end up doing and imagining things in whatsoever possible ways. That famous picture book by Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are, is entirely about this thing. He's imagining everything with the monsters, and right, and hundreds of picture books are like that. Now, you can't sort of criticize those books by saying, oh, but this is not realistic. How do you know? If you are dreaming about something, even if, and all of us are dreaming about 1,000 different things every single day of our lives, you know can we always, all of us, even as adults, can we be claimed to be absolutely realistic people? We can't. We just choose to present something in a particular medium that is socially acceptable, and that is largely the rational, realistic mode of thought. Otherwise, at an everyday level too, I think we're all engaging in, even if we don't want to, we are always engaging in practices of, in ideas and ideals of imagination. So, and children's literature does this very, very well. The other thing is like, is also that, yes, this can possibly be a more sort of a critical answer that you're looking for, that in 18th century, this genre called the it narratives started, when the, the first time the genre of writing about objects and all started very properly, right? And as psychoanalysis, and a lot of psychoanalysts have worked on children's literature, as they would argue, is that why do these it narratives and animal narratives proliferate in early ages of children's literature? Is simply because the subject of the child himself or herself, until a particular age of 4 or 5, is not able to distinguish herself or himself as a separate being, to the extent that his or her ontology then mixes and fluidly merges with the ontology of a thing, of an object, of an animal, and so on and so forth. And that is precisely the reason why, from Aesop's fables to the Panchatantra, we have children's literature having animal characters, object characters, so on and so forth. So that does have a psychological basis to it. Yeah.
I don't think there are any more questions in the chat. I
Yeah,
have
yeah.
one final last question, and then we will wrap this up.
If
Yeah.
anyone else wants to say, please feel free to. I'm
Yes,
okay.
Dr. Pandey has very kindly given his email ID and his Instagram. So please contact him if you have further
No,
questions.
even,
But I'll ask one last question and wrap this up.
I
oh,
had
no,
a
no,
question. I had a
that's
question.
Oh, okay. Hitash, take it and then I will.
Okay.
okay.
Uh,
Good.
Thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Pandey. I mean, I learned a lot. Your framework of objects, materiality, and making is something, it's so intriguing, and it conjures up in my mind so many images of things, just treasure chests, things, and objects within, not just like fantasy fiction, but all kinds of children's literature, even like adventure fiction and other genres of children's literature. You talked a lot about joy, and
Yeah.
obviously you talked about making. So, just to push this further, just to push this framework further, I would invite you to sort of talk about whether joy making can also be a framework that one can work with when we are analyzing or reading children's literature. Joy making is something that I mean, it just popped up in my head.
No, thank you for your question, and I'm so glad that my views resonated with you. So again, the thing about how do you understand joy and joy making? Yeah, again, I mean, I don't want to objectify joy at all. The consumerist capitalist society is doing that all the time. But again, I mean, because joy and joy making is something which is so personal for so many people. But I do feel that, uh, one of the reasons why I showed those few pictures from my time in Cambridge was to show that, this was to sort of portray or explore the fact that our study of children's literature was not only limited to the classroom in which we are reading it, writing papers on it, and passing our examinations or viva, right? That the idea of joy making emerged in the actual hands-on things that we made for, say, the whole Alice in Wonderland conference, right from carving out the Cheshire cat cardboard cutout, and all those kind of things, or say something like something like, especially the genre of picture books and pop-up books. I mean, the fact that these are so popular in the West, and I think although Indian publishers like Zuban and two, three other publishers are doing fantastic job in making these amazing picture books, I still feel that in India we have a lot of work to do in terms of how to create these extraordinary enticing picture books, which are not just good and happy to look at, but wonderful to engage with as well, right? So the act of joy making, think, exists at multiple levels. First, it exists at the level of the makers, people who make books for children, right? And especially small children. But I don't want to generalize it and saying that everything is rosy and dewy-eyed. That's not what I try to say. It's joy can definitely be a way of just opening up your hearts to even things which are otherwise sad or melancholic. I mean, Charles Baudelaire, the modernist poet, has this lovely quote that what did he say? I was just reading it yesterday, that I don't know of any form of beauty that doesn't also have a bit of melancholy attached to it, right? And I find it very intriguing, that particular idea, that somehow that sort of a complete absolute joy and all is always momentary and fleeting, but nonetheless, if a book is made well, if a pop-up book is made well, or if a picture book is made well, from or for that matter, even if it's a piece of cinema that is made well, the responses that it elicits will automatically have some kind of a joy. The fact that you are talking to your friend and saying, oh, did you watch that thing, it's wonderful, kind of thing, that itself is a testimony to joy, right? Where basically you have secreted and drawn that joy from the main text to your own body and mind and heart, and that then becomes the source of your bonding with your friend or with your relative, with whatsoever it is. So yes, joy making is something which is very important and crucial, but I wouldn't say it's only necessarily related only to children's literature. Sure, children's literature, given its vivacity, given its diversity, it certainly lends itself to a more explicit form of joy. But joy is something that I also find, say, in a lot of nature writing, for instance, which is completely realistic writing. If seeing a wonderful piece of description about how a tree or a landscape is described, say when Robert Macfarlane goes out into the landscape walking, whether it is Scotland or whatever it is, right? And then suddenly he is sort of moved by a simple kind of a stone, and that stone then reminds him of a particular story in Narnia or something like that. That itself is an evidence of joy as well, right? So I do feel that joy has to be talked about, and given the absolutely pathetic state of the universe at the moment, joy is very much a radical act. I was listening to an interview by Arundhati Roy, and she was saying exactly this thing, that joy should be thought of as a militant idea. That's what her words were. So yeah, a lot to talk about joy.
Diasporic author Shantini Dashgupta also says something similar in her TED talk about immigrant joy being an act of resistance, because immigrant narratives are so often so sad. Because of the idea that just because you're immigrant, you have a conflict and you're going to be talking about that conflict, and the narratives become sad. But this gives me actually a very perfect way to segue into my question, which will bring down the mood a bit, because I wanted to ask you when that joy is destroyed. For
Yeah.
example, not thinking of this as a researcher, but as a fan, as a reader, when I read a work of fantasy, for example, Stardust, I also have an idea in my head of the author, but then something huge is uncovered and the author turns out to be scummy. And that is, I mean, the joy you derive from reading something like Harry Potter or from
Right.
reading something like The Graveyard Book or Coraline, that joy is, you can never find that joy again because it's very hard to separate the art from the artist at times as well. So, what about when that joy
I
is,
was
for the lack
very,
of a
very
better word, murdered by the author?
I was very prepared for this question to come, because I was just thinking about what is this gets asked. So I'm glad and grateful that you did. Thank you so much. And it is clearly, I guess, the most recurrent question in in the literary sphere, not only in children's literature or fantasy literature, but in general literary sphere, given what all is happening and all the kinds of revelations that we are having. My simple answer would be that I don't have a single objective answer. So this would be sort of multiple answers what I'll be saying ahead. One is that yes, you do take that author to task, and you do critique or ask them, or basically create a debate about that thing, right? How could you talk about this thing, or what was your intention, or whatever it is. Like basically not use his or her stardom in order to shove the matter under the carpet, but actually create a debate about that thing, right? One is definitely that. The other thing, as I was reading one article, I think in the Atlantic or the New Yorker, I mean, and actually a lot of people have said this thing, that it is ultimately our idea and our hero worship that gets defeated when something like this happens. So the problem, actually, as much as we might think is in that particular XYZ author, but ultimately it is we who have been thinking like that as well. So one of the articles that I was in, that sort of provoked me into thinking this thing, that yes, actually, I mean, because for a long time in my life, and I still do it sometimes, I do have the habit of hero worshipping, which I know is not a good thing, which many people have told me, and I think I'm now consciously working towards it. It's also sort of a natural process, right? Once you like a piece of cinema, once you like a piece of literature, you end up feeling ultra connected to the person who has made that thing, right? And and there are thousands and thousands of testimonies that even if something like this controversial thing has not happened, when people actually meet their favorite authors, or when people actually meet their favorite directors, they are completely let down by the how he was in actual life kind of thing, right? And we keep coming across this. So I think at one point, all of this, the revelations around whether it's Neil Gaiman or Alice Munro or J.K. Rowling or so many other people, basically is telling us is to also at some level be critical of our own tendency towards hero worship, right? And to be as open as possible about that aspect of that aspect that needs to come out, whether it is their transphobic views, whether it is their misogynistic views, whatever it is, right? But I also want to say two or three things along with this, that expression, that experience of reading a Rowling or a Gaiman for the first time when you didn't know about this thing was also a very, very real and embodied reason, right? And there is no reason that you need to consciously work towards forgetting that experience, or you need to consciously work towards, oh, I was so wrong in believing this kind of thing. That is not how human psychology works, at least according to me. You keep discovering newer and newer controversial aspects, and this is not only to do with at least, I mean, I can say this safely. It's not only to do with famous artists or famous people. It's to do with every single person in your life. It's to do with your parents. It's to do with your brothers and sisters, with your friends. And they might often come a time when you are aghast by how could that person think like this. And especially in these polarized times like this. I'm writing at the moment a new history of Shimla, and I have had the great pleasure of, conducting ethnographic work for around 10, 15 years in the town. And I would consider many people my friends, and they truly have been very, very genuinely open armed to me with as much hospitality and all. And the next day I get to see that, oh, they have right wing sensibilities, and I'm like, what do I make of this thing then, right? Do I then completely go ahead criticizing them and shouting against them and canceling them? That is something that I am fundamentally against, whatever be the case. I don't think so it works, and I think it's a very immature way of sort of dealing with the whole complexity of life. So yes, you call out, you criticize, you create a discourse about it, but you also don't unnecessarily put a pressure on yourself and think about that original experience of reading or seeing that text as something that has now become tainted. I don't think so that it has become tainted, So I like, therefore, Catherine Rundle. She often speaks against, J.K. Rowling's views and all, but I also appreciate the fact that when it comes to, talking about writers and all, she in one of her recent articles, I think she ended up, or quite a long time back, she thinks of the she was talking about objects in fantasy literature, just like, me. And she said that the Pansiv is undoubtedly one of the great literary, objects from the fantasy world that Rowling ended up creating. So I think as a mature thinker, we can definitely have, both things going side by side. It's a difficult thing to do, but it seems to me to be the way out of this sort of an impasse. And final thing I would say is that, we are also a bit choosy about the people whom we ended up criticizing or berating or lambasting more than someone else. So, say the new biography of George Orwell's wife talks about the fact that he was a very big misogynist and a homophobic, right? So do we then now stop using the word Orwellian for whatever is happening across the world because we have come across with that detail? Or the fact that it is widely, well known that Foucault had predatory sexual relationships with little children in Tunisia. Do we then stop using the Foucault? We should stop using the Foucauldian paradigm by all means if we are to, use the same standard that we use for a J.K. Rowling or for an Alice Munro. We don't do that thing, right? It's like an uneven sort of a thing, and this is again where people who think that they are critical, many people, I'm not generalizing, they end up sort of making a hue and cry about it in a very sort of an unequal sort of manner, and that's what troubles me quite a lot. I therefore don't have a one answer fits all kind of a question, but I do feel that it is important to live with these kind of, what should I use the word? A kind of a disquiet that characterizes our contemporary reality, and our contemporary, like our zeitgeist, is filled with these kind of disquiets, and we just have to live with it some way or the other. But we can definitely work towards not building that sort of hero worship thing, because ultimately the ones who get disappointed it is ourselves more than the person whom we have ended up.
What is idealistic joy? It will get boring after a point. You do
Yeah,
need that
exactly.
disquiet to keep that joy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. That was an extremely thought-provoking talk. We've all gone back with lots of notes, lots of questions, and we'll be using this material. I think you've given us new ways to think about our own work. So I'm very grateful to you for that. We are very grateful to you for that. And on behalf of Eclisa, when we conceptualized this particular segment of the speaker series, this was the first idea that KidLit Beyond KidLit was the first idea that we came up with when we were talking about the speaker series. We wanted to offer that intervention. And what you offered us today was exactly what we had been dreaming about. So thank you for fulfilling those dreams of ours. And to everybody who attended, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you will also join us next week on the 28th for Dr. Divya Kanan's book talk on her new book, Contested Childhoods, Caste and Education in Colonial Kerala. The link has been shared. Titash has shared the link. Please do register for it. We hope to see you all again next Friday at 9:30 p.m. India Standard Time. And we're going to have to wrap up now, even though we, I think, all have more questions, and perhaps Dr. Pandey can come back at a later date.
Oh, yeah, I'll be very
I think
happy.
Bindu Shri has already put that in the comment box that, she would appreciate further sessions.
I think we would all appreciate further sessions.
Siddharth, you'll have to come back again.
Of course. No, it'll be my honor, and just let me know.
Demand.
That's very kind of you. I had a blast talking to all of you, and thank you so much for being such generous hosts. Anurima, Titas, Ritvika, Arpita, who is not here, all of you, thank you so much. I'm very, very happy, and all the attendees as well. I'm really, really grateful for everything. Thank you.
I'm just going to take a quick screenshot because this is our first inaugural session, and want to remember this one for the memory books. So though everybody else has pretty much turned off their video, so no one else got in. Okay.
Right.
Thank you so much.